have a volume of manga to use as a prop for this video, but I didn't bother getting any of the manga that I've actually been reading from the library to hold up, and the only volume that we own physically in the house is volume 30 of Naruto, circa 2008. So that's gonna be what counts as set dressing today. Welcome back to the bookcase. We do not have an intro. My name is Taylor, and 2025 for me has really been the year of manga. Now, part of that is because of the 5 for 25 challenge that we're doing here, where I recommended Stin 5 books to read, and they recommended me 5 books to read, except they didn't recommend me 5 books to read. They recommended me 3 novels, 2 manga arcs, and a comic book. So that's what I've been reading. Now, I have really enjoyed the manga that I've read this year, and I have even read some manga this year that they did not recommend to me. However, because this is the first year that I have been seriously reading manga, it has created an interesting effect on the way that I track my reading. It has created, shall we say, a problem. The manga problem. Now, before we get into the meat of this video, I just want to say most of what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with tracking reading statistics, and things like that. And I just want to say up front before we get into it, you do not have to track your reading to be a reader. You do not have to have read a certain number of books in a year to be a reader. You do not have to do anything at all to be a reader other than read. I don't care if you read physically, audio, ebook. I don't care if you use the library, if you buy your books. Actually, I do care if you use the library. Please use your library. But you don't need to have a pretty bookshelf behind you. You don't need to have a massive manga collection. You just need to read. That's all you need to do. I just happen to enjoy tracking reading stats. I know a lot of other readers do too. Some people don't. That's great. Love that for those people. But for me, I enjoy tracking the stats. And in doing so, manga presents some interesting challenges, and that's what I want to talk about today. Now, I track my reading a couple of different ways. I do have a Storygraph account, which you can follow if you want. I am very infrequent in my updates on there, but if you are interested, it's the bookcases. And then I also do have a physical book journal, which is really more of a scrapbook, where I make a really pretty scrapbook page for every month, and then I write down physically everything that I read. I also track quotes and star ratings in there, but the biggest thing that I use consistently to track my reading is a personalized Google spreadsheet that I've created. Maybe at some point I'll make a video on that spreadsheet specifically. I know that some people in the past over on TikTok have been interested in that, so let me know if that's something you'd like to see. But I have this big color-coded, genre-sorted, multiple statistic tracking spreadsheet that I use to track both my TBR and what I'm reading in any given year. Now, I have been tracking my reading since I got back into it as an adult in 2022, but this year, 2025, is the first year that I have really read manga. Unless you count when I read Uzumaki a few years ago, which is manga. Uzumaki was technically originally a serial manga, but it is now mostly sold as an omnibus edition, and so when I read it, I just put it down on my spreadsheet as one big edition, and then when I got Storygraph later, and I was putting in everything that I've read, I just put in the omnibus edition of Uzumaki as that one title, which works fine. We're gonna get into later what gets weird about putting manga into things like Storygraph, but I have read Uzumaki before this year, but this year's the first year that I've really been reading serialized manga that's not finished yet. That was a little bit of a tangent, but I do promise it's relevant. So, what's with the title of this video? What is the manga problem? Simply put, if you track your reading stats with a lot of specificity, the way that I do, the way that I know some of you do, trying to track manga gets very strange very quickly, because it is a fundamentally different medium from the written novel or novella or whatever you want to call it. It's a different medium. It's a different art form. It's a comic. It's a graphic novel. It is not the same as just reading prose. And because of this, however you end up tracking it, if you try to count it with the prose that you read, it's going to get your statistics in a bit of a bunch. Now, manga does count as reading, graphic novels count as reading, comics count as reading, and I will fight anybody who says otherwise. But specifically in the world of reading statistics, it gets a little strange. And if you are really familiar with reading manga, you're probably nodding along right now, going like, yes, you're exactly right. And if you're not familiar with reading manga, you're probably thinking to yourself, why? What's so weird about reading manga? What makes reading manga and tracking it different than, say, reading Heartstopper and then counting that as a couple of books for the year? Here's the thing. Manga is published, for the most part, the vast majority of manga is published in a serialized format. It is published chapter by chapter. If you're not familiar with manga, think about reading a long ongoing fan fiction on AO3. You get chapter by chapter updates, right? It's one long story, but it has all these separate installments. Stin has compared it to trying to track television shows and movies in the same way. There are key similarities between those art forms, but the delivery format and as such, the language of the medium and the amount of time that you spend with it is going to be fundamentally different. As a matter of fact, when manga is being adapted into anime, a lot of the times the individual chapters become individual episodes. Not always. I know there's nuance to that. That is not what this video is about. It's helpful for those unfamiliar with anime and manga, though, to think of it that way. Think of a single chapter as a single episode of a TV show, whereas you can think of a novel as an entire film. So if you are starting a new manga when it is being first published, you're going to be following along with it chapter by chapter as it updates, probably through a magazine subscription to something like Shonen Jump or any of the other manga serials that are out there. You're going to get it drip fed to you as the mangaka, which is the word for manga author and creator, as they work on it, right? And so you're looking at those bits piece by piece by piece, and you can already kind of see where I'm going with this, right? How do you count that if you're counting the number of books that you read? How do you count manga that you're reading chapter by chapter? Well, there is a solution for this. It is called the volume. So they published manga in chapters, serialized, but then after a little while, particularly if the manga is popular, they start combining groups of chapters together into published volumes. Roughly 8 to 10 chapters per volume. It depends on the manga and on the arc that you're following in the story, but they start publishing them, and these have ISBN numbers. And since they have ISBN numbers, that means they are on sites like Goodreads and Storygraph, so you can count by volume, right? That solves the problem. Well, it does solve the problem of how to put manga on something like Goodreads or Storygraph, but in doing so, it creates a whole new problem. You see what number is on this book, right? This is volume 30. Manga gets really long really quickly, and if you're counting an individual volume as an individual book, you're going to inflate the number of books that you've read a year, and if you're tracking other statistics too, like author statistics, that's going to throw all of that out of whack too. Again, for our 5 for 25 video, Stin recommended me the Chainsaw Man public safety arc. That was 11 volumes of manga. I try to read 100 books a year, and if I'm counting individual volumes, each as one book, 11 of the 100 books is taken up by that one story. That's 10%. 10% of my reading goal for this year was taken up by Chainsaw Man public safety arc. And that's not even talking about what happens where if you do start reading published volumes, but then run out of published volumes, but want to keep reading the story. Because the thing is, the published volumes do not come out as soon as the chapters come out. Chapters come out weekly, and then after enough chapters have amassed, then they work on printing them and selling them in bookstores. Printing is a long process. Sometimes for the translation and localization, they redo it with different translators. The translators who put the English versions of manga out in Jump are working very, very quickly. And there are some times when going to publish the volumes, they take another pass at it, do a little bit more localization, take a little bit of a longer time to make sure it's all good. You've got to print everything. You've got to ship everything to bookstores. You're going to get so far ahead in Jump or whatever magazine you're reading your manga in. That's going to get so far ahead of what is physically available in bookstores so quickly. And if you are trying to stay up to date with the story, even if you started with published volumes, you're going to end up switching to chapter by chapter eventually. And then what are you going to do? Are you just going to try and be like, okay, well, I read 8 chapters and there's about 8 chapters in a volume, so I'm going to count that as one book, even if the published volume then later turns out to have the breakdown of the chapters a little bit different. It gets weird really fast. And then, of course, we get into the other statistics that manga starts to mess with. If you read a lot of it in a year, do you track what genre you read? How are you going to count manga? Are you going to count it as a genre entirely in of itself? That's not really the most accurate. Chainsaw Man and Akane Banashi are very different genres. Just because they're both manga doesn't make them similar in any other way. Do you track what books you read physically versus what you read as an ebook? There are some volumes of manga that you can read on Libby, or maybe you're going to switch over and read the digital version of Jump, or maybe you're going to go to your library or your bookstore and pick up physical volumes. Whatever category of reading you primarily read manga in, because of how quickly you can get through a volume of manga, it takes me maybe 40 minutes max to read an 8-chapter volume of manga. You're going to very, very quickly inflate that category in terms of how much you read. I would say I mostly prefer physical books, but if I look at my ebook to physical book stats this year, I've read 30 volumes of manga so far, and I would say 20 to 25 of those have been digital. It's really skewing what my charts look like. Author gender gets mixed up in this. Author race gets mixed up in this. Whatever statistics you like to track about your books or like your authors, if you start reading manga and then try to count individual volumes each as their own book, you're just gonna throw your stats off. That's how it's gonna end up happening. My first inkling for how to fix this was to, instead of counting every volume of manga as an individual book, was to count every manga title that I read as an individual book, which works in theory, particularly for the manga that I've read this year. I finished the Public Safety arc and I'm not going to read more of Chainsaw Man until next year. I finished the Karaku Cup arc in Akane Banashi and I'm not going to read more until next year. So that kind of works, but it's not a good broad solution because manga, like I said, gets long really quickly, and some manga is still ongoing to this day. You look at this, you think 30, wow, that's a lot of volumes. Naruto, first of all, is over, and second of all, One Piece is still ongoing and has over 100 published volumes. Nobody in their right mind who recommends One Piece to somebody is going to say, count it as one book. If it takes you 40 minutes to read a volume of manga, it would take you 65 hours to get caught up on One Piece. That's longer than the Wind and Truth audiobook. Which, bringing that up, yes, reading really, really long fantasy books does also skew your statistics a little bit. We'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about different ways to track your reading, but we're talking about manga right now, not the Cosmere. So then you could go, all right, well, I'm going to count individual story arcs as individual books, not just single volumes. I'm going to go by arc. And that can work, but if you are primarily using third-party processes to track your reading, something like Goodreads, something like Fable, Storygraph, you're not really going to be able to do that because, again, tracking by volume on those platforms is the easiest because there's an ISBN number. So it's kind of a trade-off. If you're tracking in a journal or on a spreadsheet, you can kind of split the manga up how you want. But if you're tracking on a official platform, you're kind of at the mercy of the rate of volume publishing. Now, there are a couple of ways to try and solve this problem, which again is really only a problem if you take your rating statistics as seriously as I do, which I'm aware is a me issue, but hey, you clicked on the video, right? Now, one of the ways to solve this issue is to not track anything by individual book. Like, you can still say, oh, I read this many titles this year, but maybe you're gonna say, okay, I'm going to primarily count by page number. I know some people do that. They are like, I count how many pages I read in a year because to me that feels more accurate than number of books. After all, aren't some books, like Wind and Truth, 3 times the length of your average novel, whereas other books are novellas or children's chapter books? Counting each of those as one entry feels a little disingenuous. I'm going to count by page number. I see the logic and the wisdom in that. To the people who do track that way, I love it, I respect it. However, to say that tracking by page number solves the issue of tracking long books versus short books, no, it doesn't. And I'm gonna show you why. This is A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. This is book 3 in the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy. This is Echo by Pam Munoz-Ryan. Pam Munoz-Ryan is one of my favorite middle grade authors. These both look to be very long novels. If you looked at these on the shelf and didn't know anything about Pam Munoz-Ryan or V.E. Schwab, you might say to yourself, gosh, those sure are 2 books of equal length. However, once you actually open the books, you realize that is not the case. First of all, this one is a little bit longer. This one is about 625 pages. This one's about 585. So even though they look like they're the same thickness, this one is 40 pages longer. That is because the paper is thinner, but it's not really about paper thickness. That just determines how physically thick the book that you're holding is. It's about words on the page. A Conjuring of Light is an adult fantasy novel. It is not the densest book I have ever seen, but the typeface and the margins are on the smaller side. Echo is a middle grade fantasy novel. For those of you who do not know, middle grade is the age demographic of about 9 to 12-year-olds. This is for elementary and early middle schoolers. 1 page of Echo is not equal to the same amount of reading as 1 page of A Conjuring of Light. This is a almost 600-page book, but it is going to get by so much faster than reading a 600-page adult book. They are not created equal. This is for young readers. Now, if I were to read both of these this year, I would still count both of them as 1 book. But if you are counting by page number because you say it's more accurate to how long the books that you're reading are, I disagree with that analysis. And this is why. So I already take issue with using page number as a more accurate way to track your reading. And so then you bring in a manga where sometimes you have pages where there are 0 words at all. I just don't find it to be the most accurate. Reading a lot of manga in a year and tracking by page number is still going to artificially inflate the number of pages you read in a year, the same way that tracking individual volumes of manga as 1 book is going to inflate the number of books that you read in a year. The only tracking method that I can think of that manga would not affect is if you are counting by minutes spent reading or number of words read. Both of those sound really complicated to me. I don't know anybody who tracks their minutes read. It is an option that we give our kids at the library when we do summer reading activities. So like it is a valid way to track for sure. I'm not saying that it's not. For me personally, I just don't feel like going through the effort of starting up a stopwatch every time I start reading and then remembering to stop it if I get distracted and start scrolling on TikTok or get up and go make a snack and then realize that I need to do the dishes and then I do the dishes and I come back and 15 minutes just went by that was tracked as reading on my timer, but I actually didn't do any reading. I don't think it would work for me. If it works for you, I'm so happy for you. That's just not how my brain works. And then tracking by word count, I just don't really like, because you'd have to do extra research on everything that you read, whether it was a novella, a children's book, an adult book, a novel, a manga. Not to mention, tracking manga by word count is not really the most accurate way to track manga, because literally the page that I showed you earlier had maybe 2 lines of dialogue on it, whereas other pages are going to be lots of dialogue. There are some arcs that are going to be much more visual. There are some mangaka who are going to be much more visual storytellers and not have as much dialogue or exposition, whereas then you're going to have other mangaka who put a lot of exposition or a lot of explanations of how their powers work. Yes, I'm thinking of Hunter x Hunter right now. It's just not an accurate way to track how much manga you've read. It might make it fit in better to the other books that you're reading, but again, manga is a different art form, and I feel like trying to track it by word count is doing a disservice to the medium. Ultimately, I like tracking by number of books that I've read. I like knowing how many books I've read in a year. I like knowing what those titles are. But then we come back to the same problem as before. Volumes of manga, counting as individual books, makes the reading tracking really weird. But to say that they don't count as books at all discounts the amount of time that I spent on them. I try to read about 100 books a year, and to be fair, I have had a slower reading year this year, I think, but I am on track to hit my goal of 100 books, and part of that is because of how much manga I have read. I have read 45 novels or novellas this year, and I have read 33 volumes of manga. Manga is really helping me hit my number goal, to be perfectly honest. But in doing so, it is skewing those other statistics that I like to track. And that is now the issue that I have to solve. How am I going to make my stats cope with the fact that a good, 40% of what I have read this year has been manga, and therefore is skewing all of the other statistics that I track: physical versus digital, owned versus borrowed, author demographics, all that jazz. I have come up with a solution. Before I tell you what I specifically am doing, I want to provide a couple of other options for you as well, if you are someone who tracks your reading and is thinking about getting into reading manga. The perhaps most obvious solution is to just track your manga completely separately. Say, I read this many books this year, and then this many volumes of manga or chapters of manga, however you're doing that. And then saying, of the books that I read, these are the stats and demographics, and of the manga that I read, these are the stats and demographics. That might be the most accurate way to track how you read your manga specifically versus how you read your books. But I kind of like looking at one big overview of everything that I've read, be it books, graphic novels, comics, manga, etc. So you could simply live with the fact that if you are reading a lot of manga, your stats are going to reflect that, and just have one big comprehensive set of stats where you have every title that you read, and that title can be everything from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell to Naruto volumes 1 through 29, and put those all together and then count all of your statistics that way. I personally feel like that is not the most accurate set of data if you're trying to specifically track things like demographics. However, I have come up with what I think is at least for now, acceptable solution. I have kept the comprehensive list of every title that I've read in 2025, and I've counted every individual volume of manga as its own title. And I am taking all of those stats into account for my end of year wrap-up videos. However, as an example of how that is kind of skewing my normal stats a little bit, last year, 52% of the books that I read were by women writers. And this year, because 30 plus volumes of manga have been read, and every manga that I read this year was by a male mangaka, I'm sitting at 40% of my books have been written by women, which personally I feel it doesn't actually accurately reflect my reading taste. And that goes for all of the other demographic stats and also format stats, ownership stats, all those types of things. Everything else that I track, what it's doing, especially since I'm kind of trying out manga for the first time, manga is making my stats make me look like a different type of reader than the type of reader that I actually am. So to counteract this, instead of getting rid of the comprehensive set of data, I am keeping that set and then adding a second set. I call this set the reduced manga set. And in it, instead of counting every volume of manga as one title, I am counting every title of manga as one book. So instead of Akane Banashi counting as 9 books on my reading list for the year and Chainsaw Man counting as 11 books, Akane Banashi counts as 1 book. Chainsaw Man counts as 1 book. However, if I do read multiple titles that happen to be by the same mangaka, then that is still going to count as an individual book. And this is where we come back to Junji Ito. I really like Junji Ito's work. If you've not read any manga before and you're a horror fan, you should start with Junji Ito. But this year I have read 2 Junji Ito collections. I read Shiver, which is a collection of his short horror one-shot mangas. And then I also read Junji Ito's Cat Diary, which is a short serialized horror comedy. Because of that, that's counting as 2 titles on the reduced manga list. Even though it's the same author, I'm not worried about condensing the author on this list. I'm worried about condensing the titles. If I had read Uzumaki, see, we're back. If I had read Uzumaki in a serialized format, I would have counted individual volumes of Uzumaki as titles on the comprehensive set, and then Uzumaki as one whole item on the reduced manga set. Again, that is not how I initially tracked Uzumaki, because you can just buy Uzumaki as an omnibus. It's not that long. It's not One Piece. It is serialized for sure, but it's much more contained than some of these long-running shonen properties. All that to say, Junji Ito still gets 2 entries on the reduced manga list because it's different stories. Shiver is a short story collection. Junji Ito's Cat Diary is a short comedy series. The downside of the reduced manga format is it makes the number of books that I've read this year look much smaller. It takes me from 88 to 51. But in doing so, it allows me to take other stats like author demographic, method of reading, things like that, and have those be a little more accurately reflective of my taste. For instance, now I'm dealing with 55% women authors and 45% men authors, which is much more reflective of my typical reading taste. Also, as a side note, while I am calling it reduced manga, I did also read a 9-volume comic series this year, The Wicked and the Divine by Kieran Gillen, and I also reduced that on this. So on the full comprehensive set, that's counted as 9 titles, but then on the reduced manga set, it's counted as 1 title. So if you are a comic reader or a graphic novel reader, like a graphic novel series that has several entries in it, this method can work for those too. It's not manga exclusive. Now, I can already hear one potential criticism of this specific data set. If you're doing this to make your author stats be more accurate and you're reducing the amount of books that you're reading by this author, but you're counting other duplicate authors, isn't that gonna still skew your author stats? Well, yes, but I'm already way ahead of you on that. Even before I started reading manga, I was in the habit of creating 2 sets of author demographic data at the end of every year. One based on the number of books that I read in a year, and another based on the number of authors I read in a year. For instance, last year I read 101 books, but I read from 54 authors. I read a lot of the Cosmere last year, all right? Brandon Sanderson is his own statistical nightmare in many ways. Honestly, if you are someone who cares about your author demographics, if you're someone who cares about diversifying your reading and you use your stats as a way to hold yourself accountable to that, I really do recommend tracking both number of books by authors, but then also number of authors. It can kind of help you figure out a little bit better what authors you're reading from. And there are some times when, you know, one author is going to skew things massively, either because of a big long series or because you decide it's 2025 and I'm going to read every Alice Oseman book in existence. Alice Oseman's really good. You should read her. And honestly, it was that practice of keeping 2 sets of author data that really helped me come to the conclusion on manga. If I already keep 2 sets of data for authors, why not do the same for manga and how that affects what I read? It's at least working for me for now. I don't know what I'm going to do for 2026. I am considering splitting manga off from my book list and having a separate manga list, and that way I can track by chapter, because I might end up catching up to published volumes on some of the stories and then want to keep reading them anyway. I'm kind of starting to run out of volumes of Sakamoto Days, and I don't want to stop reading Sakamoto Days. So if you read both manga and books and have any advice or suggestions for me, please let me know in the comments. I am very new to this. At any rate, I hope that you enjoyed that video. I feel like it was a little bit rambly, but honestly, I could have gone on. We didn't even talk about owning versus borrowing. I track how many books that I read from my physical shelf versus books that I read from the library, and how the heck do you count a paid Shonen Jump subscription in that equation? I don't know. Maybe you do. Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if there are any other manga that you think that I should read. I am a little bit into Komi Can't Communicate. I want to start Spy Family soon. I am open to more suggestions, so leave those down below as well. If you did enjoy this video, I would appreciate it very much if you clicked the YouTube buttons there on your screen. They do YouTube things, and that helps us out a lot. But my name has been Taylor. This has been The Bookcase, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. They're moving out of the apartment downstairs, and of course, the day that I decided to film this is the day that the moving truck is just causing a whole ruckus.